Hey guys, we got another podcast here. This one's called The 1920s, The Jazz Age, and there's so much going on in the 20s that I wanted to have a podcast for you to just summarize things. So we're going to move real quick because there's so much to fit in. So, got a big old summary. So one thing that happened in the 20s was the lives of women changed a lot. First of all, the fashion styles. Women got short haircuts called bobbed haircuts. They wore these flesh-colored silk stockings, and of course, like the shorter skirts, as you see there, slightly shorter, nothing like we might think today, but showing any leg really was a lot different than what people were used to. So women had a lot more freedom. And by the way, we're talking about mostly the city life. We're not talking about people living in farm communities. That was still not going to be okay. Flappers, though, right? These women pictured below. Flappers showed women's changed behavior. They smoked cigarettes. They drank. Remember, drinking at this time was illegal, so that was pretty risky behavior. And they dressed in this what they would consider revealing clothing. I'm not sure if we would consider it that, but by today's standards. But besides just fashion, women entered the workforce as what we think today is stereotypical female jobs, like sales clerks, secretaries, telephone operators. Um, but but back then that was, I guess, pretty revolutionary that women were entering the workforce more and more and having more independence. It's funny. This is a woman working as a telephone operator. When you made a phone call, you pick up the receiver on those old-fashioned phones, and you'd say, "Hello, operator. Please connect me to Mrs. So-and-so." And so she would literally take out this little, phone jack and put it into Mrs. So-and-so's, line over here. And that's how you made a phone call back in the day. So they needed actual humans to do that, unlike today. And of course, tons of women started making contributions to science and medicine and law, literature, things like that. So things were changing. All right, moving right along. Fundamentalists. What word do you see in that? Fundamentalist. Well, yes, the word fun, but that's not quite what I mean in this case. I guess it could have been fun, but we're talking about fundamentals, like math fundamentals, as in the basics. So fundamentalists were religious fundamentalists in the 1920s. Big revival. They thought, oh, geez, these flappers, all these illegal things going on in the city life, all these people sinning, turning against God, then we need to put a stop to this, and let's have most of us turn back to God. So Americans feared we were losing our traditional values, and they thought that this modern consumer culture, right, people buying new clothing styles and getting their haircuts and all this stuff, was a problem, and it was a show of our moral decline as a country. So they wanted to step up religious activism. And they called this movement fundamentalism, focusing on the fundamentals, the basics of the Bible. And these fundamentalists believed that the Bible was literally true. Every little story in the Bible, if it says Adam and Eve were created in this year, just one man, one woman, that's true, the fundamentalists believe. If it says there was a goat when Jesus was born, in the manger scene, then there was a goat. I don't even think there was a goat, but okay, fine. That was just my example. And they totally, absolutely rejected the somewhat new Darwin's theory of evolution. Hopefully you've heard of this, at least in science class. I'll talk about evolution in a second here. But instead of evolution, they believed in creationism. Creationism, in other words, the theory that God created us as we are. And that's it. How it says it in the Bible, that's all. Sorry, there's my definition. So you can pause this and jot that down. But fundamentalists, there's two famous preachers considered fundamentalists from the 20s, and they made big names for themselves. Billy Sunday was one of them. Originally pro baseball player, made a big name for himself, but his rapid fire sermons, the sermon is like when they preach at church, and his onstage showmanship. I'm not sure what's going on here in the crowd. Either he's really angry or he's just trying to get everyone excited. So that's Billy Sunday. And then the other big fundamentalist preacher was Amy Semple McPherson. And yes, a female preacher was kind of unique for the time, I would say. But she used this flamboyant, this outgoing theatrical style with her stage sets. And look at the costume she's wearing. I mean, this is pretty different stuff. So she really caught people's attention, and a lot of people latched on. So this fundamentalist thing we're talking about leads us into the Scopes trial, which hopefully one of the groups covered in your project, in your class. 1925, Tennessee passed this law, probably like some other southern states, saying that they didn't want evolution being taught to their children in school. Because remember, evolution, the strict religious people believe evolution went against God's teaching, so they wanted their kids to be brought up with God's teaching, not this new scientific theory that they thought wasn't accurate, wasn't based on science. So a man named John T. Scopes was arrested for teaching this in school. Actually, I think he was a substitute teacher or like a fill-in teacher, but nonetheless, he taught it. He taught evolution in school. I mean, it was against the law. He broke the law. So like he was put on trial. But I mean, right from the start, he was guilty. Did you teach it? Yes. Okay, guilty. But they made it into this big, fundamentalists versus the New Age city folk kind of thing. And in case you're not remembering what we're talking about with evolution, remember this is a picture of the evolution of the human skull. So Australopithecines, or like cavemen, had this shape skull, and then eventually over however many years scientists say they turned into Homo erectus, which is a slightly more modern form of man, I guess, and then here we are, Homo sapiens. And it says cc, meaning cubic centimeters, I believe, so like the size of car engines, they measure that in cc's. So 400 cc's versus Homo sapiens brain size or head size is 1200 cc's. So in other words, we have bigger skulls. That's an example of evolution over time, scientists would say. Scopes would say. I'm sorry, Darwin would say. And another example, this is Darwin's example. He got his theory of evolution. I think this is really interesting. Have you heard of the Galapagos Islands off the coast of South America, the western coast of South America? This is where he traveled in his old wooden ship in like the 1830s or 40s, I think. And as he traveled, he found this island, and it's really secluded, right? And he found all these incredibly unique animals, including this giant tortoise. These many giant tortoises, hundreds or if not thousands of them, they're so big you could actually ride them. Now, you wouldn't really want to because they go so slow, they inch along. But off the coast of Ecuador, this is where Charles Darwin actually came up with his theory of evolution, because he observed the island's ecosystem and saw how its bird and reptile inhabitants compared to their similar South American cousins over to the east, on the actual mainland of South America. And they had these amazing differences, the colors, the sizes. Like this tortoise on the mainland was nothing like this size, but there was no predator on the island, so they were able to grow so big. So this actually is a picture of Harriet, the giant tortoise, who now lives in the Australian Zoo, the oldest living creature on Earth. And in 2003, she was 172 years old, and she was actually Charles Darwin's pet. He took her to England when he visited in 1835. Wow, and she's still going strong today. Unfortunately, everyone, I hope you're sitting down because I have some bad news. Harriet the tortoise passed away a few years ago. I think it was 2009 or 10. She's no longer with us, but wow, 172, maybe 175 years old. Pretty amazing. So anyway, that was Darwin's example. So back to the Scopes trial with him teaching evolution. Some religious leaders reject evolution, denying the word of the Bible. And so people kind of say, you know what, let's use this as an example to challenge this law. We think this law is unfair. So they brought in the biggest lawyers of the day. They brought in William Jennings Bryan, who was as the prosecutor. He was the guy trying to say that he broke the law. And he was, you can see here, a leading fundamentalist in the U.S. He'd run for president. And then his defense attorney, though, Scopes' defense attorney is Clarence Darrow, most famous criminal defense lawyer in the country. And okay, so bottom line, they made this big circus out of it, but he was found guilty because he did teach evolution. So it was really an open and shut case. But he was fined $100, lost his job, although this conviction was later overturned. So $100, what's that today? I don't know, maybe a couple $1,000, right? Not a huge deal, but even that was overturned, so it wasn't much of a thing. But the point is, it was this example of new culture and new morals, like the city life, clashing with these old American values, like the more rural and religious values. So, all right, next topic, please. Prohibition. Remember, the word prohibit means to forbid. So you could have the prohibition of anything. Prohibition of skateboarding on sidewalks. Prohibition of smoking in boys' bathrooms. Okay, but when you say prohibition, people associate it because of American history with drinking, right? In the 1920s. So the reason this movement took decades. Mostly women um, pushed for this movement, the temperance movement, over decades from the mid to late 1800s, and they finally got state by state got some recognition. But the reason they pushed for it is because, and it does make sense. They believe that if we got rid of alcohol in our society, it would lower unemployment, it would lower domestic violence, meaning like spousal abuse, fighting at home, and then poverty, which they're all related, right? If you're a drunk, you might have trouble keeping your job, therefore unemployment. And then if you're unemployed, you get into fights at home, I guess, and have domestic violence. Or even if you're not unemployed, say that you have a hard 12-hour shift at the steel mill, like say that you live in Etna or Millville, which are classic mill towns, classic American or Pittsburgh mill towns like Etna and Millville. You walk down the street to the mill, you get home. After your shift is over, you're exhausted, you stop at the local corner bar, have a couple drinks, get loosened up, and then you come home and your wife gives you attitude like, where were you, dinner's ready, that kind of thing. And so women are saying this would be eliminated without alcohol. And of course, if you don't have a job, you're poor, right? So in 1919, they convinced enough congressmen, they convinced enough people to vote for the 18th Amendment. 18th Amendment made alcohol illegal. To enforce that law, they passed what's called the Volstead Act. That was like the teeth that actually enforced the law and allowed for it to be carried out by the government. 18th Amendment. These guys are, you've seen pictures of this, them pouring booze down the sewer and breaking in, getting the illegal booze. Interesting statistics. This time period is absolutely amazing. There's so much interesting stuff going on. The speakeasies in New York City alone, they say that 540,000 people were arrested in the 20s. So 500,000 people arrested in the 20s, but still people didn't care. People kept drinking. And I'm sure overall fewer people did drink. I think I've seen that statistic that yes, the average person was less likely to drink, but plenty of people still did. And people went to these secret bars called speakeasies, and they say that New York City had a whopping 32,000 illegal bars known as speakeasies. Now, they call them speakeasies because it's like, you don't want to be blabbing your mouth about, oh, hey, you going to Joe's secret bar after work? No. You have to be secretive about it. You have to whisper and speak easy when you mention it. So you had to know the passcode. You had to know how to get in. You had to know someone. But they were everywhere. And Pittsburgh had plenty too. So organized crime is the big problem, though, because these mobsters realized, wow, this is a great opportunity for me to make some cash, and they brought in booze from Canada and up north from the Caribbean Ocean and Caribbean Sea, I guess we'd say. And Al Capone, you've probably heard of the name Al Capone, aka Scarface. Not from the Scarface the movie we're talking about. This is like the real Scarface, the original Scarface. From Chicago, made quite a name for himself. We're talking about Tommy guns, lots of violence, lots of dead people, and it's the same thing. They ended up repealing the Prohibition, the 18th Amendment. They repealed the 18th Amendment with the 21st Amendment in 1933. So 1919, 1933, that means 14 years of Prohibition. That's the total. And the reason they got rid of it was because of these mobsters making such a mess across the country. It's just like that YouTube video of that crazy lady who's on crack, who runs down the street and runs after a cop and says, hey, I need your help. Someone stole my crack. Like, she tells the cop this. I'm sure you've seen this video or heard of it. That's the problem. That's not going to happen very often, right? And usually people don't go to the police to say there's an issue with booze. When you're talking about these mobsters with alcohol, and you're talking about drug dealers today, it's the same thing. Drug dealers take matters into their own hands because they're breaking the law already. So the gun violence was just off the charts, and people got fed up with it. People were horrified living in the cities, and they just thought this was needed to change. And look at this graph, shows us over the 20th century the two highest rates of murder, time periods of murder, was during Prohibition in the 20s, And then once they got rid of it, whoop, dropped, which is good. And then during the war on drugs, spikes again. So interesting stuff, right? They're not showing where we are right now, although I think our murder rates have dropped a little bit. Next topic, not related at all to Prohibition. Although Babe Ruth did like to drink a lot, so I guess it's kind of related. Sports. What's going on in the 20s is Americans, thanks to, I guess, the unions changing the work week dynamic, shorter work days, like 8 or 10-hour work days, and then creating an actual weekend, a Saturday and a Sunday off for most people. People had time to go to things such as baseball games or operas or movies, things like that. So Babe Ruth, amazing baseball player. I mean, I'm not going to say anything else, but you just write down baseball. You know who Babe Ruth is, and broke all kinds of home run records. And Jack Dempsey, the Manasseh Mauler, they called him. Still considered the first real star of boxing. His intimidating appearance and exciting style guarantee that his fights were always major events. He dethroned Jess Willard, meaning like he was the former king, and he dethroned him on July 4th, 1919, in a famous fight, a beating considered as savage as any in heavyweight history. Willard complained after that Dempsey's glove contained an iron bolt. Well, that's not really true. I think he was just saying that his punch was so powerful that it felt like it contained an iron bolt. And it's funny because this guy was probably pretty ripped for that day, right? But you know, today our standards and we have all these physical trainers and these special diets that would make guys appear much more buff than that. But for 1920s, you know, that was pretty amazing physique. Another sports star, the Red Grange, football star. I can't tell if he looks like Frankenstein or Evgeny Malkin. I'm not sure which I prefer to compare him to, but looks like an amazing running back. Alright, next random topic. The movies was so important in the 20s. So exciting. Came out of nowhere. This industry just quintupled in popularity. They provided an escape from everyday life. Now, the first movie, I think, was technically it was right around the year 1900. I think it was 1890 something was the first actual moving picture. But as far as large scale people going to movies, we're talking the teens. We're talking, well, Charlie Chaplin, who I'll show you in a second, in the 19-teens, like during World War I. But by the 20s, it just really takes off. And look at this statistic. Millions of Americans went at least once a week to the movies. Now keep in mind, movies back then didn't cost $8 or $9 like they do today, which is ridiculous. It was just like a nickel, a dime, a quarter, or something like that. But people loved it. You could go and see what's going on somewhere far, far away in the world, which is just blew people away. And of course, Hollywood was where it arose because of the weather. It's simple. It's real simple. It's just because of the weather. It's like always 70 degrees and sunny in Hollywood, in LA. So it was just made perfect sense for the movie industry to move there, so you could film year round. So technology didn't allow sound and film. So if you see old black and white films and you hear sound effects, that's all added later, and so is music. If you went in the theater, it was silent, but they had piano players playing music, or maybe even like an orchestra, if you were lucky. But they would provide the music live for you. And so there's Charlie Chaplin. Hopefully you've seen him. I will show you a clip of him, I promise. I will show you a Charlie Chaplin clip in class. Remind me. I don't want to forget. And I think you're supposed to write this down. The first talking picture, or the first talkie, because it had sound, people were talking in it, was called The Jazz Singer. And Al Jolson performed. He was a black actor, this is pretty interesting that this happened given the time period, but he performed in The Jazz Singer. There you go. With Vitaphone, which is like us saying surround sound nowadays. Alright, next random topic. Radio, or El Radio for our Spanish-speaking friends. Remember this fun fact? 1920, first radio broadcast in America, commercial broadcast I should say, was KDKA, right? What we now know as KDKA in Pittsburgh. They broadcasted the results of Warren G. Harding's election in 1920. Now, the radio technology existed because World War I. By the end of World War I, American, I think the British maybe, were using radio technology to communicate with each other on the war front and in the late teens. But they had all these leftover radios, and it's like, what do we do with them? So a lot of people who tinkered in their basements and garages set up the receivers and changed the broadcast signals. I don't know. That's about all I can really say about it. But it became this fun toy for people, and then before you know it, they started broadcasting things to each other, like music or just radio talk. And before you knew it, everyone could afford to buy these radios because they had a lot of leftover ones, like I said, from the war, and the technology was pretty simple once you knew it. So you could listen to like baseball games from across the country. You could be living in Pittsburgh and listen to a New York Yankees baseball game from Yankee Stadium. Um, Political speeches and band performances and comedians. It's just changed everything with as far as media goes. And in 2 years, there's over 300 radio stations. It's a pretty impressive statistic. So radio becomes one more aspect of the mass media, what we call mass media today. Now, then it was going to be radio, the newest one, but then like movies and newspapers and magazines. So what's so important, I think, is that it increased our national experience and identity. What I mean is, um, if you were from Pittsburgh, you could meet someone when you go on vacation. You could meet someone from Nevada, someone from the big city like New York City, someone from Florida, and you would all of a sudden, because of the radio and because of movies, you would have all these things in common when you before you never would have. Before you, what would you have talked about to a stranger? Like, hey, did you see that last presidential election? Wow, that was pretty cool. But otherwise, what would you have to talk about? Whereas today we're so used to this, right? Because we watch all the same shows, no matter where you are, movies, bands, etc. But this really started that trend of being one national identity and having all these things in common and being American. All right, we're getting there. We're almost done, I promise. Harlem Renaissance. This haven for black Americans in Harlem, one neighborhood in New York City, just one neighborhood in New York City. Remember the Great Migration? This was that movement of black people from the South to the North, to northern cities, to get jobs during World War One, because the factories needed jobs, right? A lot of soldiers were overseas. So that's what started in the teens and then continued through the 20s. So all of a sudden, before you know it, cities in the North have way higher numbers of black people. For better or for worse. That's not the point. The point is the dynamic had changed. So for whatever reason, I don't know all the ingredients, but the Harlem Renaissance, this town of Harlem just flowered with music and art and culture is just amazing. One of the guys responsible, Langston Hughes, one of the most prolific and versatile writers of the Harlem Renaissance, became a voice of the African American experience. I encourage you to check out some of his stuff. Just Google it. I remember I read a poem of his in college, and it was real simple writing, but it just made white America realize what it was like to be a black man in America. It was real simple writing style, but it just was a voice. That's all. And finally, our last topic: jazz music, or Yaz music with a soft J, if you wish. Louis Armstrong brought jazz music to Chicago when he moved to Chicago from New Orleans, or New Orleans, if you prefer to pronounce it that way. Jazz music, totally American style music, and actually totally African American style music, to be honest, combined from Dixieland and ragtime. Now, Dixieland is things like "Oh, when the Saints Come Marching In," that kind of song, that upbeat horn, lots of horns and stuff. And then ragtime, do yourself a favor and YouTube ragtime. I think it's Scott Joplin, I believe. A lot of piano, real fun, real upbeat. So it's a combination of those kinds of music from the turn of the century. And Duke Ellington is going to become another. This is Duke Ellington down here, sorry, in his orchestra. Duke Ellington and his orchestra. And this is Louis Armstrong, famous trumpet player. Now, you've all heard Louis Armstrong. You've heard him. His most famous song from like the end of his career was "What a Wonderful World," with that real raspy voice. And I say to myself, "What a wonderful world." But that was the end of his career. His early jazz from the 20s is way different. So please do yourself a favor and YouTube it and just get a feel for what we're talking about. And speaking of jazz, there's all these really funny dance fads of the 20s. A fad is something that just like a fashion statement that comes and goes, or a music preference that comes and goes. So the Charleston, please YouTube the Charleston and see if you can replicate it. I will give you 5 extra credit points if you come into class and perform the Charleston. No problem there. Lindy Hop, as in like Charles Lindbergh, the famous pilot, the Lindy Hop, they called it. The Black Bottom and the Breakaway. So I don't really know what those ones are, but And lastly, we got the Empress of the Blues, Bessie Smith. And this is a music style. My personal favorite is I love the blues. I play guitar. If I had it my way, I would play in a blues band, even more than a rock band. But it started from old Negro spirituals, right? And I don't, I'm using that word because that's what they were called back then, Negro spirituals, as slaves. We're talking about many generations ago. Like the whole kind of whistle while you work thing, when you're working in the fields, it makes the day go faster. And belief in God got you through the tough times. So that kind of evolved into blues. And I don't know. I guess YouTube Bessie Smith. You can talk to me in class about other blues artists if you wish. And lastly, this is not on your paper, but I'll just leave you with this. Because of all the black people moving to the north, there's all kinds of racial tension. There's all kinds of race riots. I think we read about one went on in Chicago. And I just want to mention that the KKK had a huge revival. And guess what? Pennsylvania was definitely a part of this. They had pretty high numbers, actually, nationwide. I mean, compared to other states nationwide. The KKK. The KKK started, remember, after the Civil War because of the whole white versus black thing, wanting to keep black people in their place, as they said. But in the 20s, it revived, yes, for black people in the north, in cities, but also for all these immigrants, including Catholic and Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. So KKK is something we can talk about in class if you want. It's pretty interesting and fascinating and kind of disturbing. But hey, I think we're going to call it quits. Don't forget, take the quiz right now. Take the quiz on Blackboard so you can prove that you watch this. And I'm sorry this was a long podcast, but there's so much going on in the 20s and got to fit it in somehow. So it's been fun. I'll see you soon.